Garvey is here to speak to us. She is a favorite at Grace Church, and she's involved in the diocese. And since we are running out of time, we'll just let her go. And if you're coming at 10 a.m., she's doing a great sermon.
Okay. Well, it's lovely to be back. Thank you for having me again. This time, I was asked to do something with feminine images of God in the Bible, and there's no way in less than an hour that we're going to exhaust that, but we'll at least start. One of the things I think, well, it's sort of like that old thing about fish don't know about water because they're swimming in it, so it's the only thing they know, and we don't know about air because, right? There's a sense in which we use so much metaphorical and simile language that we forget half the time that that's what we're doing. And case in point, of course, is God. We use, God is not a name, it's a sort of title, but we use metaphors for God because we don't know who really God is. And what we've got is human language. And what we do is set beside the concept God something else that we know that is sort of like God. One of the problems is, or has become, that we have restricted those metaphors to just a very few, when in fact, God, if we understand this, at least partially, is much vaster than any one metaphor or set of metaphors can capture. So for instance, the metaphor in the New Testament, Jesus uses it frequently, of God is Father, or Papa, and that's perfectly legitimate. It's a good one, and it works. In many levels, it works, except for people who have had a very bad experience with human fathers. And the metaphor father can help them as a corrective to the father that they knew, but some can't get beyond that. So father is a legitimate one. It can be used. It's very useful, but it's not the only one. When I was teaching at the seminary one time, we got onto this subject, and somebody asked me, well, how many metaphors are there? There are a lot of them. In the book of Hosea alone, which is not, I would expect, a book that you read daily, just 14 chapters, and in it there are more than 100 different metaphors for who God is. More than 100. I used to be able to tell you exactly how many, but that's gone. So anyway, what we're going to be talking about are images of God, and particularly those that are more feminine than not. And although there are lots of them, there are only a few in here. But I thought we'd start, of all things, no pun intended, at the beginning, with Genesis. Because it says quite boldly in Genesis, in the first account of creation, it says that we were made in the image and likeness of God. And one of the questions is, what does that mean? You know, with children, often, when you ask them then to make a picture of God, it looks like us. Because, right? But we learned somewhere way back that God is pure spirit. God is sexless. God is other. Certainly I learned that in about the first grade with catechism. Our own catechism, when it asks the question, what does it mean to be made in the likeness and image and likeness of God, has this to say. It's really not particularly helpful in terms of what we're talking about today. But it says, it's a bunch of verbs. It says nothing about male or female. It says it means that we are free to make choices, to love, to create, to reason, and to live in harmony with creation with God. That's what the BCP, if you really are interested in this, it starts on page 845 in the BCP. But there are some interesting clues in the text itself. Now, I have given you both the Hebrew and one English translation of it. And the little words highlighted in yellow, in other translations, in older translations, that was customarily translated, God said, let us make man. Well, there's a word that means man in Hebrew, but it's not this one. This one is a pun. It means humanity, or humankind, or human being, or some other wag has translated earthling, which is a bit much for me, so I stayed with the human being part. And it's because of this. A little Hebrew for your edification. There. That is not a proper name. It's a common noun in English, in Hebrew. It becomes Adam about 2 chapters later. But right now, it just means human being. And the pun is that God makes the human being out of something that looks like a human being, right? Adamah means earth. So God forms, in chapter 2, God forms Adam from Adamah. So we're made of the same substance that the universe is made of, right? That's what the Hebrew is saying. So it doesn't say God made man, it says God made man as Peter is a man. It means God made us as opposed to trees or stones or rocks or other things, right? And that becomes even clearer a little bit later in the translation. But so God made humankind in the image and likeness, and for the likeness of God. Now, one of the other interesting little things, this is a footnote, is there's a pun that works in both Hebrew and English. That doesn't happen often. So you really want to capitalize on this. The word image is related in English to the word imagination. And the word image in Hebrew, demut, is related to dimiut, which means imagination. So they're playing with that in part. So when the BCP says it gives us, being made in the image of God, means that we get to reason, among other things. We get to play, we get to live in community with other people. All of that is related to this translation. And then at the end, see that little, what appears to be a colon? On the second line, right? It appears to be a colon. Hebrew has no punctuation, so that's not a colon. Yeah. What it is it's saying, okay, we're coming to the end of the first thing, which we call verses, and we're leading into the second thing. So that's the difference between verse 1 and verse 2. That's the demarcation in Hebrew. And then again, God creates. So the first thing is God's intention. And God's intention is to make humans in the divine image and after the divine likeness, which is kind of amazing. Somebody once asked me, if God was all in all, if there was nothing but God before anything else, then how is it that God was able to make a universe? Because God is everything. So how do we make a universe? And the medieval rabbis decided that God suicided a little. God inhaled in order to make room. Isn't that lovely for us? It's kind of self-sacrifice on the deity's part, which foreshadows something else, which happens in the New Testament, right? But there's that. And then there's this utter freedom of God and a little risk-taking in creating a thing which is made with some of the powers of God, made in the image and likeness of God. And then in verse 2 it says, unless you missed it, unless you thought Adam was something else, male and female, that the thing that's highlighted in a kind of red, those are the words for male and female. So it's very clear that the image of God here is both genders and not neuter. And not strictly masculine, but both in some way. And then there are many, many places in both the Hebrew and the Greek Testaments where the genders are used in explanatory ways to talk about the ways in which God treats with the world. Some of them are explicit and some we have to dig for. In Psalm 22, which is not on here, it's 22:9, the psalmist refers to God as a midwife. Yet it was you, says the psalmist, who took me from my mother's womb, and you laid me at the knees. And midwives in the ancient world is generally true today, but doesn't have to be. But in the ancient world, midwives were exclusively women. So the projection is that God acts like a female profession. That's explicit. And then there's a funny one. I can't remember whether I put it in here or not. It's in Numbers. By the book of Numbers, they've been trekking through the wilderness since Exodus 12. You know, it's a long trek, all the way through Exodus, all 40 chapters, and then into Numbers, and they're still going, and they're lost, and they're wandering around, and walking in circles, and they're a little fed up, they say, with the food. This is in Numbers 11, should you wish to look it up. So they complain to Moses and say, you know, we're out in the middle of nowhere, you're leading us, and all we have to eat is this disgusting manna. And they say, I don't think English translations pick this up, but they say it makes our eyes dry. It's so dry, it makes even our eyes dry. You got to get us something else to eat. And Moses, at this point, having trekked all those chapters after chapters after chapters and years after years after years with the people, has had it. You know, he's been asked to lead these people, and he's done it faithfully, and all they do is grumble. So he gets angry, not just with them, but with God. And he says to God, listen, am I the one who bore them? And I'm supposed to wet nurse them all the way through the wilderness like this? The implication is, no, you bore them. And you are supposed to be their wet nurse. So, again, a feminine image. Now, on these handouts, one of the things I've done, as you will see, is printed some words in red. And they occur on the second page, the third page, and the final page. And the translation is not always the same. Back in Exodus, we're in Exodus. So he's still tromping around with the people. And, okay, if you remember nothing else, remember Cecil B. DeMille, right? Okay. Can you remember the scene when Charlton Heston climbs the mountain and the bolts from heaven are coming in and inscribing the tablets? Okay. And then God says something like, well, have you happened to notice what your people are up to? Well, that's the first clue that something's wrong, because God is calling the people your people, not my people. Remember all that business about let my people go? Now it's your people. Why? Because they're in trouble. Does this sound vaguely familiar about parents? Do you know what your son has done today? And Moses is, again, upset about the people, and sort of upset with God, and goes down the mountain and throws down the tablets, and then God says, come back up the mountain and get 2 more tablets, and I'm going to describe to you again what I've described before. So do the words that I've given you before and write them thusly, and then gives 10 whole new things that we don't call the 10 Commandments, but they're there. At which point, Moses is confused and says, tell me again who you are. Right, we've had this thing at the bush twice, and I've gotten them out. Now tell me who you are. And God says, well, I can't look you in the face, but what I'll do is, and I might have said this to you the last time I was with you, because it's funny. You know, we call the appearance of God a theophany, meaning revelation or showing of God. A friend of mine calls this the theophany, because God passes by the backside of Moses and cries aloud, all right, I'll tell you who I am. I am the Lord, merciful and gracious and compassionate and long-suffering, long of nose, actually, forgiving thousands who are faithful to me. But the word compassion, you take a sidestep here, Greek, can be a very abstract language. It deals in abstractions easily. English can do that too, but Hebrew is a very concrete language, maybe because of its antiquity. But it deals with things that you can touch and see or know about. So the root of the word compassion, which we translate compassion and we translate merciful and we translate about hearts moving, is actually the word that means womb. So in God's self-identification, it's the first time that God really describes who God thinks God is, includes this word. And in English, it makes perfect sense that we use a word like compassion or merciful, because for the ancients, what is the womb? It is the place of nurture and warmth. And it's the place that gives life, right? We are able to do things about the womb to make it not give life. But they didn't do that. They understood that it had its own time, but it was protective. It was the place where nurture took place so that something could grow. And in its due time, come forth as life. And that becomes the central motif for the characteristic of the God of Israel. That text, the Lord, gracious and merciful, and all the rest of that, when I taught seminary, one of the things I would say to students is, when you're dealing with interpretation, and you read a text or you hear a text proclaimed, and something goes off, you think, I've heard this before. I've heard something like this before. Pay attention to that echo. Because what it's doing is saying, these two things, this one that you're remembering and this one that you're facing, have something in common. They are, in a way, interpreting each other. Like, for instance, and I'll get back to this in a second, like, for instance, the Annunciation to Zechariah, which comes the page before the one that we call the Annunciation to Mary. They're mirror images, and one is interpreting the other. And beyond that, there are ancient annunciations that go all the way back to the book of Genesis, upon which those two in Luke are depending. So these two are best interpreted by looking at the whole range of history and interpretation. All right, all of that is to say, when something is repeated in the Bible, what the Bible is saying, pay attention. This really is important. That text, the Lord, merciful and gracious and compassionate and all that, 19 times. 19 times in the Bible as the self-identification of God. One of them we usually hear on Ash Wednesday. It's the passage from Joel. And what it says, and it happens in Jonah too, is that the nature of God tips in the direction of mercy or compassion, as opposed to, yes, judgment is there, justice is there, and they're important, but when push comes to shove, the God of Israel's preference by the end of the biblical period is to go with mercy. There is a text in Jeremiah. It's been about 2 weeks since I printed this for you, so I can't remember all of the ones I put in here, but I did have it. It's on the third page at the very bottom. That's a passage in which the exile has happened. We're in the 6th century before the Common Era. The Babylonians have wiped everything out. We're going to talk about the temple later in the service, but the temple's been destroyed, the priesthood is gone, the king has been killed. All of the conventions and promises that seem to have been given by God to the people from Abraham forward have been smashed. And the question is, one of the questions is, has God gone away? Does God not like us anymore? Are we not God's favorites? What's going on? And in this passage in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is written in that period, he uses the metaphor of a woman, Rachel, who is, of course, a matriarch of Israel, who is long dead. So this clearly is a metaphor. Rachel is standing on a hill, and you see her all alone, and she's weeping. And she's weeping for her children. So we're talking about Mother Israel and all the Israelites. She's weeping for them because they are no more. Well, that's what an English translation will say, and that's correct, except there's a single word in Hebrew that's there. Biklal she'en. Ein is the word. And ein, when you're in first year Hebrew, you learn it as the particle of non-existence. Isn't that chilling? I mean, she's weeping for her children, the ein. They don't exist. They've been vaporized. And God says, don't weep anymore. The children are returning. Set up a signpost so that they can see the way home, like the stars in the heaven. Find your way. They will find their ways home. And then God goes into a soliloquy, and this is it. Is Ephraim now the metaphor for the whole people. Is Ephraim not my dear son? In English, is he the child in whom I delight? As often as I speak against him, that is, they strayed. I should have been judgmental, but I'm not going to be that. I remember him, therefore and then in English, I am deeply moved for him, I will surely have mercy. In Hebrew it says, my womb wombs on account of him, and I will have womb compassion. I will have that which is impossible to stop. I will have that. I can't help it. I can't help but love these people. So I can't help but give them life. And they use the metaphor, which is real for women, as the venue for the God of Israel. So that's one of the most powerful ones. And then, I haven't said anything, and I have to because, we're getting later, about the New Testament. One of the most famous is Jesus comparing himself to a mother hen. Now, and there is in the modern city of Israel a church which is people call the chicken church, because what it does is commemorates this moment when Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, oh, that I could gather you as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. Now, that's a maternal image, right? But the other interesting thing is, what is the image of Rome? What's the metaphor for Rome, which is their oppressor at this period? It's another bird. Eagle. So Jesus chooses not an eagle to go against an eagle. He chooses a mother hen, plump, kind of awkward birds, and says, I'm like that. That's how but hens are also extremely maternal. There was on Facebook 2 weeks ago, there are always things, little videos, and there's a video of a mother hen gathering kittens under her wings. Anyway, he uses that metaphor. John will later talk about drinking from Jesus for sustenance. And some of our great theologians from the past, names you will recognize, all used alongside masculine images of God, feminine ones. So Augustine does it, St. Thomas Aquinas does it, Irenaeus does it, Clement of Alexandria does it, and I could list more. What I'm trying to say to you with all of this is, don't get rid of any masculine images. They still work. They make sense, but they don't make sense all by themselves. There's got to be sort of a balance here, and the Bible is inviting us into that balance. It's saying, okay, God is Father, but God also acts more like, this is a type, all right, generality, also acts like the nurturing mother, right? Now, there are certainly men and fathers who are nurturing, but by and large, we think of a different image. That's not the first image that comes to us, because that's not how we have been schooled. We're given both of them. Now, in the Bible, as I said before, Hosea has more than 100 metaphors, and some of them are not pleasant. Right? My favorite, and I put that in quotations, my favorite from Hosea is, I think it's in chapter 5, you are like the pus of Ephraim. But the person who's writing that is feeling kind of removed from God on occasion. And God can seem, on occasion, downright prickly. Job says of God, I think this is in chapter 7, won't you leave me alone long enough to swallow my own spit? You're hanging over me. But in Job, toward the end, when God finally speaks, remember Job is asking, okay, if I'm innocent, I know I'm innocent, and the only one who can clear me is God. And I know God's going to speak. And finally God speaks out of the whirlwind and says, who gave birth to the sea? Or the dew? And again, it's maternal imagery. Yes, God is Father, but also God delights in the coming forth of things as inelegant as Leviathan and Behemoth, who are sea monsters. They're the ancestors of Nessie in popular imagination. And God in Job takes delight in them and asks Job if he was the one who introduced these into the world. So anyway, to cut to the chase, there are lots of ways to speak of God. And to restrict ourselves to one or two or three narrows not only our conception of God, but who God is. And so some have said, well, feminist theologians, and I am one, would have us cut off all male imagery, and I don't think that's right. There's got to be a balance here somewhere, and the text itself is giving us that license and invitation to see both and more. There's a place, it's in Hosea, of course, where God is like a mother bear. And you know, those of you who hike or have hiked, one of the instructions you're given is if you meet a bear, particularly if the bear has cubs, keep away, because mother bears are notorious for being quite violent to protect their cubs. So in Hosea, God, who's upset at enemies, says she's going to be like a mother bear protecting cubs. So, okay, you have any questions? I have, of course, lots more, but yeah.
So with all these feminine metaphors for God, yet our art and our, when I say art,
Yeah.
I guess Christian,
Yeah.
you know, all of our mythology, or whatever you want to call it, is centered around
Yeah.
God as male.
Yeah.
And so we Christians have sort of completely turned a blind eye to, you know, God as feminine. Why is that?
There are a couple of reasons. One is there was early on, with the earliest of the interpreters, were following the lead of some of the biblical writers themselves who were so put off by and censured people for syncretism. And syncretism refers to mixing religions. So that the Israelites, on occasion, you'll get it particularly in parts of Isaiah and Jeremiah, well, the expression is whoring after the gods of Babylon, whoring after the gods of Egypt. What that refers to, in part, is the fact that in other ancient pantheons, there were male gods and female gods. So there is an attempt in early Israel to squash that. So Ashtarte, for instance, is a female goddess, and she is expunged from the record. She is excoriated whenever they talk about her. There are remnants that still get through in the Bible where, in fact, Israelite religion has a bit of that too. It's just not obvious. So part of it is because the text itself is trying to downplay other religions which have goddesses. Another suggestion, not suggestion, but another reality is that for centuries, most of the people who wrote about, taught, read, could read, were men. Now, it's not their fault, or it certainly isn't the fault of most of them, that they always read he. But let me give you a really odd example. There is a parable that Jesus tells that when I was a kid, I didn't like it at all because it wasn't fair. You know how kids think things aren't fair? It's the parable about the workers in the vineyard. So, you know, they come at 6 in the morning and 9 in the morning and noon, and then the loafers come at 5 of 6 in the evening, the same, and they get paid more money. And I, as a kid, thought this is simply not fair. I mean, if you work a full day's wage, then you get that wage, and if you come at the last minute, then you get last minute wages. But that has to do with my social location. That is to say, where I grew up, the values that I absorbed from my culture. I was white. I was pretty much middle class. And I had those values. There's nothing wrong with those values, but I read the story with those values. I took those values into the story with me. But if I talk with somebody who's been poor their whole lives, who doesn't know when the next meal, where the next meal is coming from, and it's not their own fault, they're not, being lazy people, they just can't find a job, that story is good news, because they're the people who come late. Now, see, it's from their point of view, it's a different story. I think with many of the men who read it and wrote it and preached it and taught it, they weren't able to see the female stuff. It just didn't, their eyes went right over it. I can remember the first time in graduate school that I reread Genesis 2:3, the so-called fall, and thought, oh my God, Eve is really a hero there. And I'd never been taught that, but that's what the text is in fact telling me about her. The first time, again, in Hebrew, some of this you can only see in Hebrew, that I read certain things and thought, my God, it doesn't say him, it says her. Or in Luke 8, the beginning of Luke 8, it talks about some people who are wandering around with Jesus. And because we're accustomed to all these males, I was thinking it was a bunch of men. The Greek says that they're all women, but it's the pronoun they. And in English, the pronoun they can be a bunch of men, a bunch of women, or a mixed group. But in Greek, if it's all women, it's all feminine. If it's all male, it's all masculine. And if it's mixed, it's male. But in this case, it's a bunch of women who are running around with Jesus. And you don't see that in the text. But I saw it, and I think I saw it first because I'm a woman, and I'm predisposed to see those things. So I think that's part of it as well. And so sometimes it's simply a matter of not being able to see what's actually there. Because, again, of predispositions. For instance, again, this seems off the track, but I think it's germane. People have read, they've certainly heard the story, but many people have read at least part of the Bible. And often people will start at the beginning thinking they can get through the whole thing, and they get bogged down around chapter 5 of Genesis because we have the first with genealogies. But many people have read, say, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then when I say to them, what apple? There's no apple there. They're surprised because there is an apple. Well, there's no apple. But we are so accustomed to that story that we see what's not there. Yeah? Or the famous goat's monkey trial, when they had somebody read a passage that was this is brown paper packaging, something that was from the Bible, and people said that's not the Bible, and they took the wrapping off and it said Holy Bible. We expect certain things to be there, we expect certain things not to be there, and then when you open it, it actually is or is not there. Does that help a little?
A little,
Yeah.
but we're still,
Yeah.
are we doing anything to remedy that one-sidedness?
We are. For instance, this translation, it's not mine, that's printed, that's the NRSV. So in fact, we are paying some attention to that. In universities, it is, this doesn't always have to do obviously with God, because we were talking about public universities as well, but you're not allowed to turn in a paper which uses exclusive language, because exclusive language is not clear. If I want my audience to understand exactly what I'm trying to say, I don't use language that's obfuscated, that people have to search for a meaning for. It's not dumbing down people, it's bringing up people to a certain level. And it's happening, but it's happening slowly, and some people are opposed to it. And they'll say to their dying day, well, that's not what it says. And I keep saying, do you know Hebrew?
Yeah.
Because if you know Hebrew or Greek, you would see it immediately. But, sometimes, I don't think I've said this to you before. Please accept my apology if I have said it to you before. But sometimes people can be absolutely sure of what they learned in 3rd grade, and nothing has changed since then. There have been Pew researches about the level of people in congregations in terms of spirituality, and it's 12 years old. About 80% of a congregation often is at the 12-year level because they left church after confirmation and came back after the children were born. So nothing's happened in that period. But in that period, we learned to drive, we dated, we had our first kisses, we got pregnant, or begot someone, right? We've learned about high finance, we've learned biology, we've learned chemistry, we've learned about the world, but religion stays back here. So some of it is, well, that's what dear old kindly Father What's-His-Face told me when I was 9, and it must be true. Well, when you were 9, certain things seemed true, but you're now 29. And if you live as if you're a 9-year-old, you're not going to get very far in the world. If you continue to live as a 9-year-old in the spiritual life, it's going to be confusing for you. You won't be able to grapple with some things. Yes?
In Christian literature, was there ever an attempt to ascribe a masculine or feminine metaphor to the Holy Spirit?
Feminine.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Feminine to the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And I keep looking at my watch because I have to get suited up soon. Yes, because, now again, in much Christian language, it's always been he, and in part that's because Jesus is a male, and Jesus refers to Father. So the 3rd person should be a male, but in Hebrew, pneuma is feminine, and in Greek, it's neuter. And we don't want to talk about a God who's neuter. So in fact, strictly speaking, grammatically speaking, it should be she. And in the Jewish tradition, there is we didn't even talk about Lady Wisdom, which is a whole different category. But there is a slightly Jesus would have known about this, post-biblical emanation of the Godhead, who is called the Shekhinah. Shekhinah is a noun, it's feminine, and it derives from the verb which means to pitch a tent. And because the God of Israel at first was understood to dwell in a tent, and that all that wandering, God's in this dilapidated tent. The Shekhinah is the presence of God, who is always there, even when not seeming to be there. In the Holocaust, the Shekhinah was often called upon some parts of the Jewish population understood that if there was anything present to them, it was the Shekhinah, the one who pitched a tent. An interesting side note is in John 1, the great hymn to the Logos, where it says, in the beginning what? Was the Word. And the Word was toward God, and everything that God was, the Word was. It's a rough translation. In the middle of that text, it says, in English translation, it'll say, and the Word dwelt among us, right? But the Greek word is the Greek translation of the Hebrew tent. So dwelt is a great word, and it makes sense. But when you get to, and the word pitched a tent in our neighborhood, there's so much more there. You pitch a tent, not just anywhere. You have to make a decision about where you're going to pitch a tent. And at least in my childhood, it was hard to pitch a tent. It's not now. You just open the bag and here's a tent. But in the old days, you'd have to haul out canvas and ropes and pegs and find the right site. And that understanding of God as the second person who takes the time to figure out the site, and it's us. It's among us is where that tent is going to be pitched, and then pitches the blasted tent. That's a lot stronger, it seems to me, than dwelt. And it's that image that Judaism developed for an understanding, and it's a feminine principle, which is an emanation of the presence of God. It's close to our Holy Spirit. Okay, I suppose I have to get suited up. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we have just scratched the surface.
There's room for